Men with erectile dysfunction could get help with a cup of coffee. The Daily Mail reports a cup of Joe can act like Viagra.
There's a version of your morning coffee that's quietly working against your circulation, and almost no one drinking it realizes what's happening. I'm a cardiologist, and what I want to walk you through today isn't about giving up coffee. It's about one detail in how most men drink it, a detail that changes what that cup is doing to the blood vessels that also happen to control erectile function. This came up again in my clinic a few weeks ago. A patient in his mid-50s came in convinced his only issue was testosterone because that's the story he'd read online. His blood work told a different story, one that started in part with the 3 cups of coffee he drank before he'd eaten a single bite of food that morning. So let's name the problem directly. The way most men drink their morning coffee triggers a stress hormone spike that, repeated over months and years, quietly damages the same blood vessel lining responsible for a firm erection. In my own practice, close to half the men who come in with unexplained circulation numbers have this exact pattern in their morning routine, and none of them have ever connected the two. If you stay with me to the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening inside your blood vessels every single morning, and the one small addition that changes it. This isn't something most doctors have 15 minutes in a routine visit to sit down and explain. Here's what's actually happening. When caffeine hits your system on an empty stomach, first thing in the morning, it triggers a sharp release of cortisol. That's the stress hormone that, in large or repeated doses, interferes with the hormonal signaling between your brain and your testicles. But the more immediate issue for circulation is what happens next. That stress hormone spike, especially stacked on top of the sugar and syrup most men add to their cup, pushes your blood sugar up and your insulin along with it. Insulin's job is to move sugar out of your bloodstream and into your cells. When that process gets triggered aggressively enough, morning after morning, your cells start needing more and more insulin to do the same job. That's what's called insulin resistance, which is really just your body straining to process excess sugar. And that strain doesn't stay contained to your blood sugar numbers. It spills over into low-grade inflammation that reaches the lining of your blood vessels. That lining is called the endothelium. Think of it as the inner skin of every blood vessel in your body, including the ones responsible for the blood flow behind an erection. A healthy endothelium releases nitric oxide on demand, which is the molecule that tells the vessel wall to relax and widen so blood can move through easily. An inflamed, insulin-resistant endothelium releases less of it and less reliably. Picture a pipe with a clean, smooth inner wall versus one where the inner lining is swollen and irritated. Even with the exact same water pressure behind it, the flow through the irritated pipe is slower and less consistent. Your blood vessels work the same way. The pressure usually isn't the problem, the inner wall is. There's research out of major cardiology journals that has looked specifically at caffeine's short-term effect on the lining of blood vessels. And one consistent finding is that black coffee on a completely empty stomach produces a measurable temporary dip in how well those vessels dilate before rebounding an hour or two later. Stack that dip morning after morning on top of a diet that's already pushing you toward insulin resistance, and you end up with a vessel lining that spends more of its time in that constricted state than it should. The mistake I see most often isn't drinking coffee itself. It's assuming the fix is either giving it up completely, which almost nobody sustains past a couple of weeks, or switching to decaf, which barely touches the insulin side of this at all. Some men also assume that because they feel fine, nothing is happening internally. But vascular inflammation of this kind is quiet by nature. It doesn't announce itself with pain or discomfort the way an injury would. It shows up first in blood work, then in circulation, and only much later as a symptom you actually notice. The actual lever sits somewhere else entirely, and it's smaller than most men expect. Before I get into what that lever actually is, I want to be honest about something, because knowing this mechanism and actually changing your morning routine for more than 4 days in a row are two very different things. Most of the patients I see aren't missing information by the time they sit down in my office. They already know sugar is a problem. They already have a vague sense that coffee might be an issue somehow. What they don't have is an order to put any of it in. What to change first, what to add second, and how to tell whether it's actually working before they give up and decide none of it matters. And with something metabolic like this, that order matters more than usual. Insulin sensitivity doesn't improve because you overhaul your entire diet for 3 days and burn out by the weekend. It improves through small, specific, repeatable changes to the same routine, tracked long enough to actually see the number move. Try to fix everything about your morning at once, with no way to measure whether any of it is working, and most men conclude that nothing helped, when the truth is they never gave any single change enough consistency to show up in their own blood work. That's part of why I put together a 90-day plan that organizes exactly this kind of change into a sequence instead of leaving you with a pile of disconnected advice. For a pattern like this one, it starts with two things: a simple structure for your morning meal and drink, what goes into that first cup and when, and a short walk after eating, which is one of the most well-documented ways to blunt the blood sugar spike that follows a meal. The meal structure works directly on the insulin side of what we just walked through. The walk works on it from the other direction, giving your muscles somewhere to send that glucose instead of leaving it circulating in your bloodstream. You start with a short check-in on your current morning routine and then track just those two changes on a simple weekly log. Nothing complicated, just enough to actually see whether the pattern is shifting. This isn't medical treatment, and it doesn't replace a visit with your own physician. It organizes the parts of this that are within your control, and it's clear about the signs: chest pain, shortness of breath, or any sudden change in how you feel. That means it's time to get evaluated instead of adjusting habits on your own. The plan is linked in the description if you want to see how the full 90 days is laid out. Now, back to what you can actually start doing tomorrow morning. The first thing to change is timing, not the coffee itself. Drinking your first cup on a completely empty stomach is what produces the sharpest cortisol and blood sugar spike, because there's nothing in your gut to slow down how fast any of it hits your system. Even a small amount of protein first, a couple of eggs, a handful of nuts, a spoon of plain yogurt, blunts that spike measurably. The practical version of this is simple: eat something small before your first sip, even 5 or 10 minutes before, rather than coffee first and food as an afterthought. The second point is the one most men have never heard, and it's the actual reveal behind this video: adding about half a teaspoon of ground cinnamon to your coffee. Cinnamon contains compounds that appear to slow the rate at which sugar enters your bloodstream after a meal, which takes some of the pressure off the exact insulin response we've been talking about. It's not a dramatic fix on its own, but stacked with better timing, it's a small, repeatable adjustment to a habit you're already doing every single day, which is exactly the kind of change that holds up over 90 days, unlike a diet you abandon after 2 weeks. Before I keep going, if this is connecting some dots for you, hit like on this video. It sounds small, but it genuinely tells YouTube to put this in front of more men dealing with the exact same pattern without knowing it. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time, because the next few videos build directly on what we're covering right now. The third piece is the added sugar and flavored creamer most men pour into their cup without thinking twice. A couple of pumps of syrup and a splash of flavored creamer can add more sugar to that first cup than a slice of cake, and it stacks directly on top of the cortisol spike from the caffeine itself. You don't need to drink it black if you don't want to, but cutting the added sugar in half is a realistic starting point that most men can actually sustain past the first week. The fourth is the short walk after breakfast I mentioned a moment ago. 10 to 15 minutes of walking after you eat gives your muscles an immediate place to pull glucose out of your bloodstream, which is one of the most consistent, well-supported ways to blunt a post-meal blood sugar spike. It doesn't need to be a workout. A walk to the end of the driveway and back, or a loop around the block, does the job. The last one is the piece people underestimate the most: hydration before that first cup. Coffee is a mild diuretic, and most men are already walking around slightly dehydrated by the time they pour their first cup, which on its own thickens the blood slightly and makes it marginally harder for it to move through a vessel that's already inflamed. A full glass of water before your coffee, not after, is a small habit that supports the exact blood flow we've spent this whole video talking about. None of these 5 changes will show up on a lab test tomorrow morning. What they do over months is shift the baseline your blood vessels are operating from. Less time spent inflamed, more time able to dilate properly when it actually matters. There's a broader pattern I notice in patients who make small, unglamorous changes like this consistently versus the ones who don't, and it goes well beyond a single symptom. The men who get their morning metabolic pattern under control in their 50s tend to look like a genuinely different patient by the time they're in their 70s, not just in erectile function, but in blood pressure, energy, and how their heart handles a flight of stairs. One thing I noticed that never makes it into a published study is this. The men who fix this pattern early usually don't come back describing some dramatic before and after moment. They come back saying they just feel steadier energy through the morning, steadier mood, fewer of those unpredictable afternoon dips. That steadiness is the endothelium doing its job the way it's supposed to, even if nobody ever frames it that way. It's a small, almost boring kind of improvement, and in my experience, the boring improvements are usually the ones that last. So here's what we covered. The real reason your morning coffee habit might be quietly working against your circulation, the cortisol and insulin mechanism behind it, and 5 specific changes: timing, cinnamon, less added sugar, a short walk, and hydration that you can start applying tomorrow morning. Tell me in the comments, how many cups of coffee do you have before you eat anything in the morning, and had you ever connected that to how you feel later in the day? Insulin sensitivity doesn't respond to a dramatic overhaul that lasts 4 days. It responds to the same small adjustment, repeated most mornings, for weeks at a time. The men who actually see their numbers shift aren't the ones who get it perfect. They're the ones who stay consistent through the ordinary mornings, not just the motivated ones. The 90-day plan is there to give that consistency an actual structure, a way to track it, adjust it, and know when it's time to bring in your own doctor instead of guessing. It isn't a treatment, and it isn't a replacement for your physician. It organizes what's already within your control. You'll find it linked in the description and in the pinned comment. Open it, look at how the Noventa days are laid out, and decide for yourself, without any pressure, whether that kind of structure is useful to you. What changes a number on a lab report was never the best morning of the month. It's what you're willing to repeat on the ordinary ones. Metadados, episódio sublinhado. Título: Add this to your coffee and see what happens to your erection. Formato sublinhado. Episódio: alerta / revelação, instrução + resultado prometido, especialidade sublinhado. Narrador: cardiologista, gancho sublinhado, tipo: revelação de mecanismo metabólico oculto por trás de um hábito diário considerado neutro, dado sublinhado. Gancho: observação clínica de paciente de meados dos 50 anos, convencido de que o problema era só testosterona, cujo exame revelou um padrão ligado a 3 xícaras de café em jejum. Mecanismo sublinhado, biológico sublinhado central. Pico de cortisol induzido pela cafeína em jejum somado à resistência à insulina, gerando inflamação vascular de baixo grau que compromete a função endotelial e a liberação de óxido nítrico. Recurso sublinhado, retorico sublinhado. Dominante, café como vilão e veículo. O hábito não é condenado, é corrigido pela adição específica revelada no movimento 3, canela. Analogia do cano com parede interna inflamada. Itens, sublinhado. Praticos, sublinhado. Abordados. Momento do primeiro café em relação à refeição, comer antes de beber. Adição de canela ao café. Redução de açúcar / creme adicionado. Caminhada de 10 a 15 minutos pós-refeição. Hidratação antes da primeira xícara. Componentes sublinhado. Plano sublinhado, mencionados. Estrutura de refeições e redução de açúcar. Pilar 5, alimentação e hábitos metabólicos. Caminhada progressiva pós-refeição. Pilar 2, circulação e saúde endotelial. Tipo sublinhado. Resistência sublinhado. Previa sublinhado. CTA2, tipo E. Frustração com excesso de informação. Pacientes já sabem o que evitar, mas não tem sequência de aplicação. Barreira sublinhado, implementa cal, sublinhado, CTA2, tentativa de mudar a dieta inteira de uma vez sem baseline nem rastreamento, o que impede ver o efeito de ajustes pequenos e cumulativos, elementos, sublinhado, concretos, sublinhado, produto sublinhado, CTA2, checklist de ponto de partida, rotina matinal atual, mais rastreador semanal de consistência, urgência, sublinhado clínica, sublinhado CTA3, sensibilidade à insulina progressivamente comprometida pela manutenção do padrão metabólico ao longo do tempo, pergunta sublinhado engajamento. How many cups of coffee do you have before you eat anything in the morning? And had you ever connected that to how you feel later in the day? Tese sublinhado central. O café em si não é o problema. O que você adiciona a ele e o momento em que você o toma determina se ele ajuda ou atrapalha a circulação e o equilíbrio metabólico que sustentam a ereção. Elementos sublinhado, evitar sublinhado. Próximo, especialidade cardiologista, gancho de revelação metabólica ligada a hábito matinal, mecanismo de cortisol / resistência à insulina, ingrediente review canela, componentes de plano ligados à alimentação e caminhada pós-refeição, resistência tipo E, barreira de mudança abrupta sem baseline, urgência de sensibilidade à insulina, pergunta sobre quantidade diária de café,